The idea of an airbender narration was something that has been on my mind for years, even after the series ended, especially with how some are disappointed with how the Legend of Korra is and how many end up coming back to Aang. This entire narration will deal with The Last Airbender, or how it's called in Europe, The Legend of Aang. There will be no real references to Korra in this video. There will be certain aspects of the show that will be discussed. From my personal observations and fan speculation I remember reading on the internet during the time the show was broadcasted in America for the first time. First, let's discuss the nations in detail. The Water Tribe is often hard to pinpoint, because fans have all sorts of theories as to which people they refer to. Most people agree that they are similar to Inuit, or Eskimos, seen in the indigenous regions of Greenland, Nunavut, Alaska, and Siberia. More peaceful, and the family structure seems to be closer than the Earth or Fire nations. Great importance is placed on marriage, as seen with Sokka and Yue, and the Moon Spirits also reside there as seen in the Season 1 final, The Siege of the North. It's also less stressful to live there, unlike the other regions of the world. My own opinion that it's reflective of Southeast Asia. I always got that impression as it's less developed than the Earth, Air, or Fire nations. But they're also stronger than they look, as proof of fending off a Fire Nation invasion. Although they can defend their small regions, it's nothing when compared to the Earth Kingdom. The largest of all the nations, it also seemed to have the most problems. It's obvious that the Earth Nation is a reference to China during the late years of its final imperial dynasty, the Qing dynasty, at which some of the most horrible atrocities were committed against the Chinese people in all of its thousands of years of history by Western nations. The Earth King is a striking similarity to Puyi, the last emperor of China. When asked by others as to why the Earth King did not know about the corruption of the Dai Li or the situation of the war, he mentions that he spent his entire life within the actual Earth Kingdom palace. In other words, the generals and Long Feng were the actual people who rule the empire. Much like Toph said, he's just a puppet. The last emperor of China was also just a figurehead, used by both the Republic of China and Imperial Japanese governments. Much like China throughout its history, and just like the episode title, Ba Sing Se was truly the city of secrets and lies. I even know one friend who had trouble pronouncing Ba Sing Se when they first heard of the city, so he called it Beijing instead. Mentioned in that episode, all of the people of Ba Sing Se did not know the situation of the war outside the walls, besides the failed attempt by the Dragon of the West, Iroh. Apparently, the Dai Li wanted to keep the fact that the Fire Nation was encroaching upon its furthest border towns as seen in the episode Imprisoned, where Earth Kingdom town was actually under Fire Nation military rule, and Jet, where Jet's family was killed in a Fire Nation attack, as Jet was a non-bending fighter like Sokka. Added to that, the Dai Li were so corrupt that they turned a blind eye to one Earth Kingdom general who had gone insane in that attempt to force Aang into the Avatar state by nearly killing Katara in the episode The Avatar State. During the late Qing dynasty, the situation was just as bad, having interior rebellions such as the Taiping Rebellion, where the leader Hong Ji Quan, a person who failed to pass the imperial exams repeatedly, went insane as a result and called himself the long-lost brother of Jesus Christ, and declared a Christian war against the Imperial Manchu government. Estimates range as high as 20 million people dying in the rebellion, and it got so bad that the Qing asked the British, French, and American armies for assistance in stopping the rebellion. The Dai Li themselves were always a good concept, as Azula once said, earthbenders with a firebender's sense of ability and accuracy. Their attire was similar to that of Imperial Qing officers' clothing, more so than any other officials in the Earth Nation. Ironic because the Earth Kingdom generals have a more Ming Dynasty appearance. Long Feng also had the Qing appearance, similar to the old Chinese Fu Manchu stereotype of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Fan speculation had it that with the Earth Kingdom generals fighting off the Fire Nation's advances into its territory, the Dai Li, under the control of Long Feng, kept Ba Sing Se in an iron grip. It's also easy to imagine that the Dai Li were responsible for the young women of the Earth Kingdom being abducted and brainwashed into becoming Judees, as we'll go deeper into that theory. In my opinion, the single best episode of the entire series was in Season 2, Lake Laogai. This episode always intrigued me with all of the implications and references, but the fan speculations took it even further. The Dai Li are in essence kidnapping women for trivial crimes and locking them up in a secret prison complex where they suffer psychological torture. They then reprogram or re-educate the victim, erasing their identity and turning them into a Judy. Such brainwashing was common practice in the early years of the communist regime on the Chinese mainland. People had to be brought into the insane doctrine of Chairman Mao's ideologies. What better way to do it? Constant brainwashing and subtle references, as seen when Katara asked Jet where he had disappeared to. Upon help from Katara's healing, the exact method of the Dai Li's brainwashing was shown. The Dai Li's brainwashing methods were so perfect that even Toph couldn't tell that Jet was lying. It had to take a combination of Jet's own fierce will to remember and Katara's healing water to force out the brainwashing. In other words, under normal circumstances, the brainwashing is permanent, irreversible. Let's go into the topic even further. How long has this been going on? At the very least, it's got to have been happening for decades given Long Feng's position within the government and advisor to the Earth King. If this practice didn't originate with Long Feng and the corruption of the Dai Li stems back even further, then it may have been occurring for most of the 100-Year War. That means hundreds, if not thousands of women were systematically abducted by the Dai Li over the span of generations. Worst of all, the show completely glosses over what actually happened to the Dai Li or Lake Laogai. We're left to assume that the White Lotus Society probably stopped their operations, and the Earth King was able to reassert his control as the actual ruler of the Earth Empire. Yet we still have no real understanding of what happened to the victims of this horrific program. Possible outcomes are as such. Theory 1. They were all released back to their everyday lives after having their memories of Lake Laogai modified or erased. Theory 2. They were liquidated, along with the Lake Laogai facility as part of the cover-up, cutting their losses. Theory 3. When Lake Laogai was covered up, the Dai Li and the politicians in the know tried to recover their losses by selling all the Judis into human trafficking. Think about it. Imagine the amount of money people would pay for the perfect slave. Brainwashed to do or be anything you wanted. That's how effective the brainwashing was. The human trafficking, slavery aspect is probably the most despicable part of it. A humanitarian crisis of sickening proportions covered up in the madness of a century-long war. Who would notice a few missing people among that kind of refugee crisis? Whole families and villages were displaced over the span of a century. And there were likely, no doubt, an endless stream of refugees from both the front line and the occupied territories, as seen from Earth Kingdom borders in the episode The Serpent's Pass. Sad to say, this is probably right. Realistically speaking, there'll be nothing to do with these women. Their memories may be, or most likely are, irrecoverable, and many of them were probably refugees with no home or families to return to. Either they continued to use them until they all died, or they, either the Dai Li or Earth Kingdom politicians, generals, or nobles, probably just dumped them somewhere so they can just forget and pretend that everything is okay once the war ended, which would be consistent with Ba Sing Se's ignorance is bliss policy. Much like China at the time, the upper class refused to believe that the nation was falling apart. One such example was a marble boat, refurbished by Empress Cixi in 1893 with funds originally meant to modernize the Chinese Navy. The most extreme forms of Chinese denial came with the Boxer Rebellion, in which the Chinese wanted to force out the foreigners by taking up arms and believing in them so that they could simply repel bullet fire and free the country from foreign interests. But the rebellion was crushed, and the Eight-Nation Alliance, which consisted of Japan, Russia, Britain, France, United States, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, paraded their armed forces through Beijing, and the riots, rape, and looting ensued for months afterward. But shown by the frown and breakdown seen by the original Judy when Katara and Toph snuck in to meet the Earth King, the Judis can possibly break their mental programming, as they might have the need to have their indoctrination refreshed in order to maintain coercion. It's likely that with just time and basic interaction, the foundation of the conditioning would crumble and break down, as seen when Long Feng invited Judy to Lake Laogai. it can be too severe to just break with mere willpower. More speculation shows that it's likely some kind of effort to rehabilitate the victims was made, official or otherwise. Once word got out about the Judees, even ones in distant parts of the Earth Kingdom or even the Fire Nation probably received some kind of treatment. You can't possibly have hundreds of brainwashed young women around Ba Sing Se. Of course, the mental trauma and destroyed lives would probably never fully heal. It's possible that some victims lost years of their life to it. The idea is very interesting. Obviously, most of them are now dead or old women, but in the post-war years there were probably dozens or hundreds of them within Ba Sing Se alone. Imagine an official or unofficial halfway house where the victims try to recover. Every day the damaged women try to regain some measure of control and exercise over their lives as they attempt to reintegrate into society. Some recover a measure of their old lives. Some successfully reintegrate and go on to live normal and productive lives despite the damage. Some can't handle it and end up in the slums. Some can't stand the sight of Ba Sing Se and leave for parts unknown. Some never quite leave the halfway house. Fast forward to modern Korra times, the remaining Judees were dumped in the lower ring, with no purpose or place to go. Just human refuse from a past people would want to forget. All of that, theory or fact or both, was done wholly or in part because of the Fire Nation. It's clearly obvious that the Fire Nation is modeled after Imperial Japan during the Second World War. The most militaristic of all the nations, propaganda for the war is seen in all levels of society, even in children's schools, as seen in the episode The Headband, where the children have to recite the oath of loyalty to Fire Lord Ozai. What the Fire Nation did to the Air, Water, and Earth nations was seen by the Fire Nation people as patriotism, protecting the homeland by striking out at the other nations first. Such actions were taken by Japan in 1895 when some were warned that the British, Dutch, Americans, and Chinese as threats to Japan. So the Japanese at the time argued to strike first to avoid any conflicts on the homeland. Such parallels could be seen by the Fire Nation's strikes against the Air Nomads, a genocide. But for all of the Fire Nation's actions, much like Japan, it did not start out like that. As mentioned in the episode, The Firebending Masters, the art of fire was actually a beautiful, peaceful art, before the Fire Nation turned it into the essence of war. Much like Japan at the time, their mindset and ideology was not dangerous or nationalistic, just their own beliefs. But radicals took those beliefs and changed it, warped it. Throughout this series, there have been examples that innocent Fire Nation people can be stereotyped into the heartless killers that the Fire Nation army was. Much like overseas Japanese people who were stereotyped as the butchers of Asia during the war. They were the subject of crimes wherever they lived, the most extensive of which happened to the Japanese Americans, with the Japanese Americans being put into internment camps. Also mentioned is the fact that the Fire Nation was once religious, but the military nationalism replaced that. No doubt to continue effort to promote the war. Only in the Fire Nation was the concept of colonials, as seen in the episode The Painted Lady, Fire Nation people living in Earth Kingdom territory. As mentioned in the episode, The Avatar and the Fire Lord, such an idea is blasphemy and must never be done. People of one nation should never live within another. The only ethnically Fire Nation person to be seen in favor by all of the nations was Avatar Roku. Once again in the Avatar and the Fire Lord episode, he's shown as being neutral and supportive of all nations, even attacking Sozin for taking Earth Kingdom territory. Toph and Sokka mention that all of the Fire Nation people are ruthless and criminals. But Aang's story makes them rethink their ideas about Fire Nation people. Rethinking the Fire Nation may be alright, but what if there's no nation left to think about? The Air Nomads are mentioned the least throughout the series, mostly because of the genocide that Sozin authorized at the start of the war. Although I've heard some call the Air Nomads Chinese, my opinion as well as others refer to the Nomads as Tibetans. The most spiritual of all the nations, arguably, the Air Nomads were also the most peace-loving. Pacifists by nature, they are also the one nation that's the most detached from the world, living in the mountains where it's actually rather hard for other nations to gain access into Air Nation territory because of that fact. In the episodes, the Southern Air Temple and the Storm were given glimpses through flashbacks into airbending life before the Fire Nation genocide, as most men are boys and monks. even though women can be monks also, as seen with Avatar Yang Chen. The air nomad monks spend time studying nomad scripture, being cheerful, and debating various things. Studying scripture and debating the passages is extremely important in Tibetan Buddhism. Speaking with a Tibetan friend of mine, she also explained to me the concept of the relationship between the student and the teacher, which is actually referred to the relationship of Aang and Monk Gyatso, as technically Aang never found out in the series who his birth parents were. He saw Monk Gyatso not only as his teacher, but possibly as a spiritual father or grandfather. There's not much else to speak about the air nomads because most of their culture was lost to the outside world after the Fire Nation genocide. All we know of the Air Nations is Aang and the information that he provided. In the Southern Air Temple episode, Aang was excited at the idea of survivors at the temple, saddened only to find refugees inside one of his people's former homes. Insulted by the lack of respect they showed to air nomad culture and artifacts, he demanded they leave. They were about to. Through the episode, the people showed to have had the same spirit that the air nomads once did. Although Aang did mention that they will be a bit more respectful of his people's heritage. With the nations discussed, let's go into a few themes of the series. The concept of bloodbending was the darkest aspect of the official cartoon. In the episode, The Puppet Master, Hama was a waterbender who had been imprisoned and hinted at being tortured or even possibly raped for years. With no water for her to use, she eventually discovered that blood had water within it, plasma for her to use. With that, she escaped and decided to have her revenge on the Fire Nation for what they did to her. In the episode, disappearances were mentioned to have been going on for years, even decades. In the flashbacks, Hama was a young woman when she escaped. In the present, she was an old woman. It's easy to imagine Hama had been torturing, killing those seemingly innocent, peaceful Fire Nation people for an undisclosed amount of time. Most likely it had been going on for decades. Bloodbending was so effective that even Aang was powerless. If Korra's adventures is put into continuity, nothing less than an Avatar state is strong enough to break its control. I love the idea of a new art being developed by the will of someone strong enough to break out of the situation that they're in. Speaking of that, Toph did the same thing. Metal bending in the episode The Guru, Toph learns the new art of metal bending, when metal bending is essentially refined earth as mentioned later in the series. So in theory, any earthbender could learn metal bending, but it would take an earthbender of extraordinary skill to attain the level of experience which Toph did. Remember that scar on Song's ankle? In the episode The Cave of Two Lovers, I came upon a small fan theory as to how and why she got that burn on her ankle of all places. Why would a Fire Nation soldier go out of their way to burn a young girl's ankle? Wouldn't burning her around the wrist or face have served the purpose of punishing her or making her fear them? Song was probably trying to crawl away from a soldier who had her on the ground and was trying to possibly rape her. Looking at the scar, it seems to travel up her leg all the way to her thigh. Easily a reference to the rape of Nanking parallel. That actually makes sense in a tragic sort of way. Combustion Man, or Sparky Boom Boom Man, was another dangling plot which seemed to be taken care of in a rushed way. If we only refer to the series, then the character is an extremely vague idea. I like the premise of a loose cannon that posed a danger to Aang and everyone besides Azula, Long Feng, and Ozai. Fan speculation had him being the weapon of the Fire Nation, a sort of assassin who mastered a new method of bending similar to Hama and Toph. Variations of the existing forms of bending. Hama devised blood bending from water bending. Toph devised metal bending from earth bending. And Combustion Man devised concentrated explosions from firebending. Zuko originally hired Combustion Man to take out Aang and the gang, but it looked like Combustion Man proved to be a dangling plot idea that no writer could effectively finish. Hence why Zuko hastily said for him to cancel the contract, and how he died during the episode The Western Air Temple, a good idea that was executed poorly. Another lost idea was the spirit world. Heavily featured in the first season was the concept of the spirit world. My Tibetan friend told me once that Tibetans might hear things sometimes because of their awareness to the spirit world. Air nomads once again take that from the Tibetans possibly, as Aang often mentioned the spirit world and went to it a few times, but the idea was later abandoned in favor of other things. Even though Aang himself said that he was the bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, that eventually meant little. Ko is a spirit and thus a creature of symbolism. He theoretically represents some force or idea in the Avatar universe, even if that just says something simple as a fear of the unknown, as most monsters are. Just as Wan Shi Tong represents the accumulation of knowledge, Haibei represents the natural countryside, and Tui and La represents the ocean and the moon. Ko probably the embodiment of emotion, ironically. He won't steal faces unless they are showing some sort of expression. Any expression. One of the last times that the spirit world was mentioned, in my opinion, was in the episode The Swamp. Mentioned by the Swamp Benders, a subgroup of waterbenders, the swamp is a place where time has no meaning, which made sense because Aang saw Toph, a friend he knew later in life, but his first vision of her was before they had actually met. Even though the spirit world was mentioned later on in the end of the series to actually tie up some plot ideas. One of the most important unresolved plot elements was the fate of Zuko's mother, which has been the source of extensive fan speculation. If we only use the cartoons as a reference, then Zuko's mother is undoubtedly alive, forced to flee most likely for Zuko's safety. It's clear that Ozai actually knew where Ursa was the entire time in a sort of disturbing way. Lightning is another new technique devised as a new method of bending. Mentioned in the series, lightning is a technique that only the Fire Nation royalty knew. Iroh created a new way of reflecting an otherwise unblockable attack. Iroh mentioned to Zuko in the episode Bitter Work, as an ordinary firebender would find lightning difficult to use, let alone the reflection technique he devised by watching the waterbenders. In the final battle, Ozai was extremely surprised to see that Aang could deflect lightning, reaffirming the now wrong idea that lightning was an unblockable attack. Another concept is airbenders once again. According to the theory, Aang is very clearly not the last of the airbenders. In fact, when this show was released outside of America, it was called, once again, Avatar: The Legend of Aang. This seems fairly obvious once you might consider it. If every Avatar must master all 4 bending arts and the old Avatar must die in order for the new one to reincarnate, then if Aang is really the last airbender, the Avatar cycle breaks with his death. The next Avatar would have no one to learn the airbending arts from. But beyond the logical considerations, several details in this show might reinforce this idea without ever directly referencing it. The characters visit the 4 different air temples. There are either 4 or 5 depending on the circumstances or your point of view, but only the Southern Air Temple, the one closest to the Fire Nation, has any damage or signs from battle. While the Fire Nation is a nation, the Earth Kingdom a kingdom, and the Water Tribe or tribes, the airbenders are called nomads. Mentioned in the episode The Headband, when Aang finds that the Fire Nation children are taught that the glorious leader Fire Lord Sozin defeated ferocious airbender armies, Aang responds, quote, "But the airbenders had no armies." It's easy to see how the militaristic and xenophobic leaders of the Fire Nation might have inflated a single battle at one temple to glorify a war, even if they couldn't find any other airbenders possibly to fight. After all, the Fire Nation supposedly exterminated the airbenders 100 years before they gained access to airships. It's very plausible that after seeing the carnage at the Southern Air Temple, where, if we were to notice, there were a great many Fire Nation soldier remains and very few airbender remains, the air nomads simply decided to pack up and move away, somewhere where the other nations could not reach them, since at that time they were the only people in the world who had the technique or power of flight. I've also heard a lot of references in the nightmare that Aang had in the episode Nightmares and Daydreams, but that's for all of you to speculate on. One important aspect of the show that's only mentioned at the end of the series literally is the lion turtle, that mentions the world before the Avatar. How energy bending was the original art before it split into the elemental bending we all know now. As mentioned throughout the series, if we look at this concept even further, we look at how the art of bending originated in its various forms. With water bending, it was the moon. With earth bending, it was the badger moles. With fire bending, it was the dragons. And with airbending, it was the air bisons. It's how Aang was able to stop Ozai without killing him. Since according to airbending ideology, you can't kill unless it's the absolute last choice you can possibly make. One fan speculation I heard that the Avatar existed so far for about 2,000 years. Easy to believe since the entire Chinese dynastic history was about the same period, but the history overall of the previous avatars isn't really mentioned. Before Aang, who was from the Southern Air Temple, there was Roku, who was Fire Nation. Kyoshi, who was before Roku, was Earth Nation. Before Kyoshi, it was mentioned at the end of the series there was Kuruk, who was from the Northern Water Tribe. Before him still, it was Yang Chen, who was from the Western Air Temple. And the furthest back in the original Avatar series was an unknown Fire Nation avatar. Lastly was how the series ended. I personally thought that the series ended a bit quickly, and I remember reading fan theories on the internet that some noticed this also. Things began to be rushed. Arguably after the Boiling Rock episode, Chit Sang blackmailed the others into letting him escape. And after that episode, he went with them to the Air Temple. After that episode, he was never seen again. If he was at one of the Air Temples, how could he get back to a normal city? Looks like an idea that was quietly written out. The White Lotus is actually a group based in Chinese history. The Order of the White Lotus was actually called the Lotus Sect, a movement with Buddhist ideologies that traces its origins to points in Chinese history and have had parts in rebellions against ruling dynasties. Time before the existence of the avatars is something that's also once again rarely mentioned in the series, aside from a few spiritual beings, among the most important being the lion turtle. Such a creature is heavily mentioned in Chinese, even Japanese mythology to various degrees. Quoted from a historian, in China had divine attributes. Tortoise shell is a symbol of unchangeability, as a symbol or rank when used for court girdles. The tortoise was also used for purposes in divination. A gigantic mythical tortoise is supposed in the Far East to live in the depths of the ocean. It has one eye situated in the middle of its body. Once every 3,000 years it rises to the surface and turns over on its back so that it may see the sun. Also how everything was finished. Azula simply banished everyone, including the Dai Li. The Earth King went on a journey. That's it. A nice happy ending with Aang and Katara kissing. But if we were to only look at how the series as a method of closure, then there's a lot of unanswered questions. I personally thought that another book or season would be made which would put all of these questions to rest. An Air book. Like the effects of the war finally being over, the ramifications of everything, possible Fire Nation backlash, or even hate crimes against the Fire Nation people still in the Earth Kingdom colonies, what happened to the Dai Li after Azula banished them, Zuko's mother, Aang rebuilding the Air Nation, so on and so on. I also don't understand the online fascination between fans wanting Katara and Zuko together. Others might know more about this than I would. That's it. Of course there might be more, but the important topics have been mentioned. Leave a comment with your thoughts.